So all of you, this huge crowd, will show up at some of the other events later on this week. So we kind of named our events at Blount Women Behaving Badly, and of course, widely interpreted what that means. But one thing that fascinates me as a historian is, first of all, how few stories of women exist in history, and how rarely we tell those stories. But then also, when somebody's story remains, it's either because they were really, really good or really, really bad, and that they exist in the historical record because they were either really, really good or really, really bad. And one of the really, really bad ones, maybe, is Elizabeth Bathory. So let's talk about her. Elizabeth Bathory was a Hungarian noblewoman born in 1560. Traditionally, she is credited as the most prolific serial killer in history ever. Certainly the most prolific female, but I can't even think of a male serial killer who killed more. Some people credit her with at least 600 deaths of young women and girls. But her story is a little bit more complicated than this. More recent scholarship shows the potential that it was political enemies and economic enemies that kind of smeared her reputation for varied reasons, but mainly because she was a woman who lived on her own and had control of her life in a time when that was very, very rare. So, as I mentioned, Bathory was a noblewoman. She was from Hungary. She was born of a noble family in Transylvania. As I talk to my students, of course, that's where all the vampires are from. She is associated with vampirism, so perhaps she's adding to some of that story. This is a region of modern-day Romania. Her family was Protestant, and this was a time when it wasn't super cool to be Protestant. And so some of the smearing of her name could be associated with the religious issues as well. The leadership in she was part of the Holy Roman Empire, the leadership of the Holy Roman Empire, the emperor was Catholic, her family was Protestant. But the Holy Roman Empire was very, very fragmented. And so because of that fragmentation, the emperor never had super control over things. And so this allowed people like Bathory to get very wealthy as a Protestant in an area controlled by Catholics. She was also a member of the nobility. And as a member of the nobility, she learned not just Protestant values, particularly frugality, which was kind of in opposition to the Catholic opulence, but she also learned how proper court manners. She learned how to read and write. We actually have things that exist from her, written by her, which is really, really rare. She had a tough upbringing. She suffered from epileptic seizures. She also had mood swings and painful migraines. This was due to a serious medical condition. Now it would be treated with medicine and other things like that. But at the time, people obviously would have no concept of what made her sick. Instead, they would have said that they were linked to some kind of moral or spiritual shortcoming. So then the cures would include physical abuse, spiritual intervention, and usually traumatic spiritual intervention. And this would be traumatic to anybody today, but she was reportedly 4 or 5 when she started having these epileptic seizures. And so at 4 or 5 years old, she was being severely beaten and punished for something that was completely out of her control. At the age of 13, she was engaged to an 18-year-old nobleman. She married him at the age of 15. That's pretty common for the noble class, although yicky from modern perspective. Early in her marriage, Hungary engaged in a war against the Ottoman Empire. This was a religiously motivated war. The Ottomans were Muslim. Of course, the Austrian-Hungary and the Holy Roman Empire was mixed but dominated by Catholics. This bloody war resulted in Hungary splitting in two. Parts of Hungary went to the Ottoman Empire, parts of Hungary went to the Holy Roman Empire, but the Catholics in charge of the Holy Roman Empire blamed the Protestants. They said that the Protestants were Satanists and witches, and that the Protestants had worked to undermine Christian authority. And so it was all God punishing Hungary for these religious problems. And of course, remember, Bathory was Protestant, so she's going to be wrapped up into some of that. Her husband helped fight against the Ottomans, so he was gone for a lot of those years in their early marriage. And she had to defend the estate. She defended the estate, of course, with her servants. She wasn't by herself, but with the servants. And she also offered refuge to anybody escaping from the raiding Ottomans. So kind of a nice person, probably. However, in these years, some of the rumors of her being pretty, really, really bad, as I started, start to be spoken around. According to some of the accounts, her husband helped her engage in acts of violence, reportedly for the pleasure of his young wife. One notable example was when he restrained a young girl, covered her in honey, and they watched as insects tore this young girl apart. Reportedly also, her husband gave her spiked gloves so that she could properly beat the servants when they weren't doing what she wanted them to do. The couple had 4 children. One of her children grew up to father somebody who attempted to overthrow the Holy Roman Empire, well, later on. This indicates that the family continued with revolutionary activities well after her death. After her husband died, she took control of the castle and the local villages around it, and she was in charge. So again, I mentioned at the beginning, she was a woman who was in control. She wasn't married. She had control of her finances, and that is going to put her at odds with the prevailing culture. It was the period following her death that we really start seeing the associations of her and her being a serial killer. The castle, well, in the castle, she would bring in young women to work as servants. And the first alleged victims were poor girls in the village and surrounding areas. They would come and work in servant work. She would lure them in with kind of promises of a good job and some kind of education. And, you know, who wouldn't want to work for a strong woman and, you know, all of those things, right? So because most of the early victims were poor, few officials cared what was going on. There were reports of missing girls. They went to the castle. They never came back. The parents grew really worried about their children that were missing. They were all girls, incidentally. There was rumors of violence that became so widespread that parents would hide their daughters so that their daughters wouldn't be recruited to work in the castle. According to reports at the time, or a little bit when she was brought up on charges, she tortured her victims in horrible ways. And so, you know, warning here. She would burn people with hot irons, of course, physical abuse with clubs, with her beautiful spiked gloves and things like that. One of her favorite things to do, according to reports, was to cover young women their naked bodies with freezing cold water and leave them outside so they would freeze to death. She especially loved cutting her victims with scissors, mutilating their bodies and their faces. Because of these horrors, she earned the nickname the Blood Countess and was associated with being a vampire. She was also associated with diabolism, making deals with the devil. And so, you know, all of these rumors started flying around. Perhaps the most well-known accusation against her was that she liked to bathe in the blood of her victims, that she did this to maintain her youth and beauty. So again, kind of playing into that vampire idea. It's very important to note that none of these specific accounts started until after her death. And so nobody was saying that she was bathing in the blood of her victims until after she died. None of the first-hand accounts said anything about it. While nobody in official positions cared when she was making victims of poor women, she allegedly expanded her chosen victims to daughters of the gentry. And now this is when people are going to start paying attention. The daughters of the gentry were sent to the castle for education and for opportunity. And after wealthy daughters began to disappear, the king of Hungary, here's a map. Here's her castle, sorry. The king of Hungary, King Matthias II, is going to launch an investigation. The investigation resulted in 300 witness accounts detailing acts of violence, all of those mentioned above, plus a lot more really horrible things that I didn't want to mention. You can Google it, it's disgusting. But it is once again very important to note that none of these accounts were witness accounts. None of these people saw this firsthand. Instead, they would give accounts of what they heard other people see. So I heard Cletus down the street, saw this happen. There weren't any accounts from anybody that said, I saw this happen. And so that kind of leads to the muddiness of this whole series of events. At the end of the investigation, the investigator charged Bathory with the deaths of 80 girls. Those 80 were gentry. Nobody cared about the poor girls. One witness said that Bathory herself recorded the names of 650 victims. And so this is why she's associated with a lot more. But it seems like this diary where she recorded the names never existed, or nobody's ever found it. They found other writing from her, but not the recording of the 650 dead. So maybe not a reliable witness. At the end of the trial, one of Bathory's helpers was convicted of witchcraft and burned at the stake. Bathory herself was bricked up in her castle in an isolation room where she died 4 years later. And so we can go, gosh, we've caught a murderer. Justice has been served. Isn't it great? We've done what we were supposed to do. Maybe not, because there's all kinds of muddiness in this water. I've already been laying this pathway down for you guys, right? A lot of the witnesses didn't come forward and say that they saw things specifically. They just said that they saw somebody else said this. The diary that supposedly recorded all of the names didn't exist or never came forward. She wasn't accused of the most horrific acts until after she died, and then people were like, now of course, victims may not come forward when they don't feel safe, and so I don't want to say that this is absolutely the case, but there's some other stuff that kind of points to perhaps Bathory not being as naughty as we think of her as being. So remember, part of the reason why we can suspect that perhaps she wasn't as bad as these accounts give her is just the victim, or just that she could have been part of like a campaign to make her look bad. Remember that she was a woman who lived on her own. She didn't conform to social norms. She was wealthy. She didn't need anybody. And so all of this is going to kind of make her a target at the very least. There is no doubt that she was violent to her servants. She wrote that she was violent to her servants. And while that is not acceptable for modern standards, it's not unheard of at the time. people were pretty horrible to their servants. And so she wrote of physical abuse towards her servants when they didn't do their jobs correctly. She never said she murdered anybody, who would, but she never said that. There are reasons to suspect, though, other complications to the story as well. So, for example, there were the religious motivations. Bathory was a Protestant. The emperor and the rulers of the Holy Roman Empire were Catholic, and this put them at odds with one another. This is a time of major religious upheaval and turmoil. This is just a few years before the 30 Years' War, which started as a religious problem between Catholics and Protestants as they fought it out for control. And so this very much could have been targeting a wealthy Protestant and trying to take a wealthy Protestant down, right? There were other economic motivations too. First of all, the King Matthias, owed her husband a ton of money, and he refused to pay it. And after her husband died, she tried to collect on this debt a couple times, and he refused to pay it. And so there's obviously a motivation there. The king doesn't want to pay a debt. Why not get rid of the person that he owes the money to, right? There's another economic motivation. I said that the king launched an investigation. The investigator was another nobleman from the area, Bathory's cousin. And so, had she died of natural causes and not been accused, her estate would have gone to her children. But because she was accused of a crime and found guilty of a crime, her estate goes to the next of kin, her cousin, not the children. And so he did inherit her very sizable estate as a result of her being accused of this crime. So as I mentioned, nobody witnessed the violence or the murder firsthand. Some of the quote-unquote evidence is either missing completely or comes to surface after her death. Now again, some people may not have felt safe until after she died, and so that is very, very, very reasonable to assume. I'm just muddying waters here. And there's a possibility that local villagers would have had a reason to give fake accounts, specifically because she was a woman in a position of power and they didn't like that a woman was telling them what to do. And so, while this is a complicated case of a woman behaving badly, and I'm not sure that we'll ever fully know what happened until I build the time machine that I plan to build at some point. This leads me to a second, less developed question that I wanted to be my first question, but I didn't have time. And so this is, stay tuned for next year, because I plan to develop this question. But it is why so few stories of women doing kind of just everyday things exist. Why do we have only stories of really, really good women or really, really bad women and really kind of nothing in the middle? Why is a lot of women's history kind of told as George Washington's wife or as like periphery characters to the great things that men were doing? Think about Sacagawea and how she helped Lewis and Clark, the reality is they would have never made it without her. And she was 14, 15 years old and had a baby in tow, and she kept them alive as they went across what becomes the United States. But she's taught as kind of a periphery character, that she was just there and, okay, I'm glad she was there. She translated a few things, whatever. And so why do we tell stories like that? And how can we fix it? And these are all the bigger questions that I really want to dig into. So I plan to do that next year, so stay tuned, is what I'm saying. But a lot of that kind of is rooted in who tells the stories. And so that's really what I want to get into. And who has the ability to learn to read and write, who's telling the stories about women, and oftentimes it's men. There's a really famous kind of meme, and I know you guys, my huge audience, has looked at some of this as literature professors, but the men writing women in literature and how sometimes it's really, really ridiculous, right? And if you haven't, look up some of that stuff because it's funny. But if you don't do your research, you're not going to tell. I'm not saying men are incapable of telling women's stories. I'm saying that if you're not willing to do the research, it might not be a fully developed story. And so then we get the stories of the bad girls because they're going to serve as warnings. This is what will happen if you're a bad girl, or the good girls. And this is what you should aspire to be, the virgin or the whore, essentially. And so those are the stories that we get in history. And that's coming next year. I have about half of it written, but I knew I wasn't going to get it finished in time. All right. Questions from the 3 million people in the audience? All right. Yes. Oh, and some of my sources, there is a book, Countess Dracula. There are a lot of biographies and videos. Some of them are good. So be careful when you look at some of that stuff. Some are good, some are not, because it's such an intriguing story, that's why some are good and some are not. So, thank you very much. You can go ahead and stop me. All the people out there watching, right?